Today, we delve into the story of Amerigo Vespucci, a man whose name became the title for an entire continent. He commanded no armies, was not the first to reach the Americas, sought no mountains of gold, and participated in no grand conquests. And yet, it was precisely he who first understood that what lay before Europe was not Asia, but a new world. In this journey, you will discover how a young Vespucci grew up among books, numbers and maps in Florence, and why his childhood played such a pivotal role in his future. What did he witness off the coast of Brazil? And how exactly did he arrive at the staggering conclusion that he was looking at a new continent? Why, after his death, did disputes erupt over who the true discoverer was? And does his name deservedly remain on the map? This is a story of observation, precision, and the power of human thought. A story of a man who did not conquer lands but managed to comprehend their true scale. Somewhere in the heart of Florence, in a house belonging to the respected notary Amerigo Vespucci, a boy was born who was destined to forever change the European perception of the world. He was named Amerigo. 15th century Florence was not just a city, it was a laboratory of the Renaissance, a nexus of arts, sciences, and new ideas, a place where thought was valued no less than gold. Here, scholars and artists lived among books, globes, and blueprints. The Vespucci family belonged to the esteemed burgher class. Anastasio, Amerigo's father, practiced as a notary and was known as an honest, modest, and educated man. His brother, Giorgio Antonio Vespucci, was a Dominican monk and a teacher at the monastery school of San Marco. It was he who played a crucial role in shaping young Amerigo, becoming not just an uncle, but a mentor in the realms of knowledge so essential in the rapidly changing world of the late 15th century. Amerigo received a superb humanist education steeped in Florentine tradition. His mind was sharpened by the study of Latin, rhetoric and logic, while the practical sciences of arithmetic, geometry, and the fundamentals of astronomy gave him the tools to measure the world around him. From a young age he learned to handle maps and celestial tables, which was then a sign not only of erudition but of practical utility. While specific records of his teachers are scarce, it is highly likely he was educated within the circle of the humanist school at San Marco, where classical knowledge coexisted with a vibrant interest in new discoveries and technologies. Raised in a spirit of curiosity and precision, he was drawn early on to cartography and measurement. In the Vespucci home, one could find not just religious treatises, but also translations of Ptolemy's works, sketches of planispheres, calculations of solar eclipses, and copies of Portuguese and Genoese maps. This environment fostered a worldview that was not confined by the borders of Italy or the Mediterranean Sea. By the late 1470s, Amerigo began to interact more closely with representatives of the powerful Florentine branch of the Medici family, primarily with Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, a cousin of Lorenzo the Magnificent. This Lorenzo was an educated man with a passionate interest in new ideas, from astronomy to mechanics. He managed a vast trading network stretching from Florence to Antwerp and Seville, and it was in this environment that Amerigo began to master the fundamentals of commerce and maritime logistics. Amerigo was not merely an employee of the Medici house, he was part of a trusted circle, handling calculations, accounting, and in time the provisioning of expeditions. This was a practical education where financial precision met the inherent risks of trade caravans and sea voyages. Though he had not yet set foot on a ship's deck, his interest in the world's structure, navigation and measurement was already evolving into something more than a mere academic hobby. There is evidence to suggest that during these years he began studying methods of determining latitude by observing the pole star and the sun, mastering the use of the astrolabe and other instruments employed on ships. He also observed the creation of sea charts with their meticulously drawn coastlines, compass roses, and notes on dangerous currents. However, the economic situation in Florence was unstable. After the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Medici lost their influence, and political turmoil, fueled by the religious sermons of Savonarola, made life for many families less predictable. It was during this period that Vespucci faced a choice: remain in his native city, where political and commercial prospects were dimming, or test his fortunes abroad, where new horizons were opening not just on paper, but on the real open sea. He made his decision and set out for a place where the paths of dreamers, merchants, and captains converged. Seville, one of Europe's most important ports and the future capital of Spain's maritime expansion. When Vespucci first arrived in Seville, he entered a city rapidly transforming into one of Europe's premier maritime capitals. Ships moored along the Guadalquivir River, merchants from various nations bustled about, and warehouses, port taverns, maps, and compasses filled the scene. The air was thick with voices speaking of new lands across the ocean. All of this formed the pulse of the era. At that moment, Spain was still processing the news of Christopher Columbus's first return, and Seville, as the largest commercial and administrative centre of Castile, was becoming the place where the fates of future expeditions were decided. Vespucci's move to Seville was tied to the business of the Florentine House of Medici. After the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent and the exile of his sons from Florence, the city's political landscape had changed dramatically. Many members of the Florentine bourgeoisie began seeking more stable business conditions abroad, including Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, Amerigo's patron, who continued his commercial activities through foreign branches, including one in Spain. Vespucci, by then experienced in accounting, asset management, and possessing knowledge of maritime logistics, was sent to Seville as a trusted agent. There, he took a position in a company that conducted business on behalf of the Medici, collaborating with influential merchants connected to Seville's trading community. Amerigo was responsible for managing accounts, overseeing shipments, and, most importantly, provisioning the ships that sailed to the Canary Islands, West Africa, and later to the newly discovered lands in the west. In this world, at the crossroads of commerce and sea routes, he found himself at the very centre of the action. Seville was abuzz with tales of unknown countries, gold, natives, new plants, and ocean currents. It was here that the successes and failures of the first expeditions were debated, and arguments raged over whether Columbus had truly reached Asia or had stumbled upon something entirely different. And it was here that Vespucci began to converse with men who knew firsthand what the horizon looked like beyond the Old World. He grew close to sailors, navigators, ship suppliers, and pilots. Of particular significance in his biography were his contacts with Juan de la Cosa, the famous cartographer and a participant in Columbus's voyages, and with Vicente Yáñez Pinzón, the captain of one of the ships on Columbus's first expedition. These acquaintances, as mentioned in documents and letters, had a profound influence on Vespucci. He not only listened to first-hand accounts, but also studied the maps drawn from these new routes, comparing them with Ptolemaic projections and pondering the discrepancies. Although Amerigo himself had not yet participated in any voyages, he was already actively involved in preparing expeditions. He was distinguished not only by his knowledge of navigational theory, but also by his practical ability to organize everything necessary, from the precise calculation of provisions to assessing the quality of ship supplies. He knew how much drinking water, salt, hardtack, vinegar, and cured meat to take, how to select goods for trade, how to draft contracts between ship owners and investors, and how to evaluate the risks of sea travel, where a storm could instantly negate all calculations. According to documents, it was during these years that he began to apply his astronomical knowledge, not just theoretically, but in preparing navigational calculations. He understood how to determine latitude from observations of the sun and stars, and knew how to use an astrolabe. Even then, he was contemplating the imperfections of existing world maps. His observations increasingly led him to believe that the discovered lands did not fit into previous geographical models. Gradually he transitioned from the category of an observer to that of a participant. He was sought out as a consultant for organizing sea voyages. He participated in purchasing ship equipment, assisted with route calculations, inspected the condition of vessels, and worked with navigational instruments. More and more he found himself on the docks, not as a bystander, but as a man whose opinion carried weight. Vespucci was part of the circle where the fates of new expeditions were decided. His name already appeared among those who supplied and prepared ships, who made the calculations, and who knew how to chart a course not by lines on a map, but by celestial reference points. Some sources claim that in 1497 he himself embarked on an expedition, possibly to the coast of what is now Central America. However, the reality of this voyage remains a subject of debate. Some historians believe that the voyage he described was actually a later memory, embellished or edited for political reasons. Others maintain that it did take place and even preceded Columbus's third voyage. Whatever the case, a turning point had occurred in Amerigo's life. He was no longer just a man who supplied ships, but had become someone who wanted to step beyond the known world himself. For him, the path from the ledger book to the world map was not symbolic, but literal. The port of Seville was no longer just a place of work, but the point from which his internal compass could only be directed toward that continent. Soon, he would step aboard a ship to see with his own eyes the shores he had heard so much about from others. But that would be a completely different story. The story of a first voyage that would change his destiny and forever inscribe his name in the history of geographical discoveries. In the spring of 1497, as claimed in letters attributed to Vespucci himself, he took part in a maritime expedition to the newly discovered lands across the Atlantic Ocean. This journey remains a subject of intense debate to this day. However, it was this voyage that Vespucci associated with his first personal contact with the New World. The expedition, according to his accounts, consisted of 4 ships and departed from Cadiz. Who led it is not reliably known, nor is the final route. Presumably, the vessels sailed past the Canary Islands toward the Caribbean basin, possibly to the coasts of Venezuela or Central America. Vespucci, with his astronomical training and navigational skills, participated in observations, kept a log of latitude and weather conditions, and assisted in determining the course by the stars and the sun. The voyage, like all ocean journeys of that era, was fraught with difficulties. The oppressive heat, the danger of storms, the crew's fatigue, and the constant tension at the sight of any sail or shadow on the horizon. Every day began with checking the rigging and the state of the hold and ended with prayers, not only for the crew's health, but also for good fortune in uncharted waters. When land appeared on the horizon, it was a moment Vespucci described with astonishment and reverence. The coastline seemed continuous. Green hills, dense vegetation, white strips of beaches, and lines of trees stretching down to the sea. The landing, as he wrote, occurred at a place where the local inhabitants showed no aggression. They came out to meet the crew unarmed, their faces and bodies painted, adorned with feathers and shells. The contact was cautious but peaceful. Gifts were exchanged. Vespucci noted that the Europeans offered simple items like glass beads, knives, and mirrors, and in return received cotton goods, feathers, unfamiliar fruits, and occasionally small gold ornaments. He carefully described the natives' appearance, their speech, their physical build, their welcoming rituals, and their daily habits. All of this was perceived as evidence of a completely different world, with different laws and concepts of life. On one stretch of the coast, the expedition discovered a village with huts roofed with palm leaves and hammocks suspended inside. Women prepared food in clay pots while men wove nets and sharpened wooden spears. Children ran along the sand, sometimes playing with objects that might have been washed ashore by the sea. Vespucci described a scene where a village elder, without saying a word, traced an arc with his finger from the sun to the sea, a gesture he interpreted as an attempt to explain the visitor's origin. The crew moved along the coast, stopping in bays, collecting samples of wood, plants, and stones. Vespucci recorded the climate specifics, described brightly plumed birds, the scent of the trees, and the sound of waves in the coastal thickets. He was particularly impressed by fruits with thick rinds and juicy pulp, later identified as papayas. He also mentioned a drink prepared from ground seeds and water, with a bitter taste, which is now known to have been an early form of cocoa. In one of the bays, the sailors discovered the wreckage of another vessel. Upon their return, the ships carried no gold or exotic animals, but in Vespucci's memory, something far more important was stored: the sense that he had seen a land unlike any described in the known geographical works. Upon arriving in Spain, he began to compose letters in which he described what he had seen with wonder and precision. Addressed first to friends and influential patrons, these letters became the beginning of his literary legacy. Although the authenticity of this voyage is disputed, it played a crucial role in Vespucci's self-perception as a discoverer. He was no longer just an observer, a merchant or a supplier. He had become a witness to a new world, one Ptolemy had never written about, and one that no European scholar had yet managed to place on a map. It was with this journey that the internal shift began, one that would soon lead him to the shores of South America and to one of the most important geographical discoveries of his time. In the summer of 1501, at the invitation of the Portuguese crown, Amerigo Vespucci joined an expedition organised to explore the recently discovered South American coasts. A little over a year had passed since Pedro Alvarez Cabral's discovery, and now the Portuguese were eager to explore and secure the new lands for themselves, those that, according to the Treaty of Tordesillas, fell within their sphere of influence but remained largely uncharted. Vespucci, with his experience, astronomical knowledge, and skills as an observer, was included in the crew as a specialist whose opinion could influence the worldview that Europe was forming. The fleet, according to various sources, consisted of 3 or 4 ships and was commanded by Gonzalo Coelho, a navigator known for his voyages along the African coast. Amerigo was not the captain. His tasks were to conduct astronomical observations, measure latitude, describe the peoples encountered, the flora and fauna, and, crucially, to draw conclusions about the geographical position of these new lands. His participation was supported by King Manuel I, and judging by his surviving letters, he was fully aware of the significance of the role entrusted to him. After crossing the Atlantic, the ships reached a coast that stretched from north to south, far further than expected. The expedition began to move along the shoreline, making stops in coves, river mouths, and natural anchorages. Landings were frequent. The crew surveyed the land, established contact with the local population, and gathered fresh water and wood. During this time, Vespucci kept detailed journals noting the latitude, the direction of currents, the strength of tides, and celestial reference points, information essential for creating more accurate maps. The natural world amazed him with its richness. He described forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. Monkeys leaped through the foliage, brightly coloured birds cried out, and the air was filled with the sweet, humid aromas of the tropics. He was particularly astonished by the glowing insects that flickered in the night's darkness over the shore. He wrote that these were the lights of nature, like stars. These observations would become some of the first European descriptions of the Brazilian rainforest. One of the tribes they contacted lived in a coastal village of longhouses with woven walls and roofs of palm leaves. Amerigo noted that the inhabitants were open and curious, showing no aggression and watching the foreigners with interest. Vespucci observed their daily life with fascination, how the women ground flour from manioc roots, how the men cooked fish in clay, how children played by the water with simple toys carved from wood. He meticulously described plants unfamiliar to Europeans, nuts with oily flesh, fruits with a bittersweet taste, and leaves possessing medicinal properties. He was especially struck by the local people's skill in processing the poisonous juice of the manioc. They would squeeze it out, dry the pulp, and from the resulting mass prepare flatbreads that were safe to eat. This process seemed to him remarkably precise, requiring keen observation and experience. As they progressed southward, they reached a cape that historians believe corresponds to modern-day Cape São Roque or Cabo Frio. Vespucci described how in this area, the Atlantic current became particularly strong, and the water was warm and rich with fish. In one estuary, they entered a river whose banks were covered with vines and roots descending from the trees directly into the water. There, the expedition encountered another tribe, more reserved and with a clear hierarchy. The exchange was cautious. The chiefs observed the actions of their tribesmen, maintaining control over the situation. On one such day, during a stopover on the shore, Vespucci observed the night sky and recorded a crucial discovery for himself. For the first time, he clearly saw the constellation of the Southern Cross. His description, which later appeared in his letter Mundus Novus, was one of the first accurate European accounts of this celestial landmark, so vital for navigation in the Southern Hemisphere. He measured its position relative to the horizon and noted, "Europe does not know these stars." This meant the sailors had indeed travelled far beyond the familiar world. Pushing further, the expedition reached latitudes close to the modern-day territory of Rio de Janeiro, perhaps even further south. Vespucci increasingly asked himself, how could such a lengthy coastline be explained? Why was this a land that had nothing in common with the India described in books, nor with Cathay? He noted that the language of the natives, their customs, clothing, food, and way of life bore no resemblance to Eastern civilizations. He began to doubt that a new route to Asia had been discovered. Everything pointed to the fact that this was a different, previously unknown part of the world. Upon his return to Lisbon, Vespucci brought back not only plant samples, notes, and sketches, but also a conclusion that was beginning to take shape in his mind. The discovered land was not part of Asia. It was a separate, immense, and unexplored entity. While he did not yet call it a continent, he already noted that it stretched for thousands of kilometers, had its own stars, its own nature, and its own people. These conclusions would become the foundation of his subsequent letters, and would define the very idea that would soon change the map of the world forever. When Amerigo Vespucci returned to Lisbon after participating in the Portuguese expedition along the South American coast, he carried with him an idea that had not yet been fully formed into words, but had already crystallized into a powerful intuition. The lands he had seen did not belong to Asia, India, or Cathay. They were something else entirely. Not a part of the old world, but a new land, unknown to ancient geographers, undescribed in the works of Ptolemy, and unfamiliar to both Arabs and Europeans. Over the several months following his return, Vespucci systemized the astronomical and geographical observations he had made during the expedition. He cross-referenced coordinates, recorded details of the landscape, climate, flora, and fauna. Most importantly, he analyzed the route, the length of the coast they had traveled, the nature of the currents, and the complete absence of any signs of the Eastern civilizations they had expected to find in Asia. He wrote to his friends in Florence that he did not believe in the Asian nature of the discovered lands. In one letter he emphasized, "I have seen a land so vast that, although we sailed along its coast for more than 800 leagues, it seemed to have no end." These words marked a turning point. Until then, Europeans, including Columbus himself, had tried to interpret their discoveries through the lens of the known. Every new land was an island off the coast of Asia, and every native an Indian. Vespucci was the first to publicly question these assumptions. He saw no Chinese cities, no Hindu temples, no golden palaces from the tales of Marco Polo on these new shores. Instead, he saw boundless forests, people speaking unfamiliar languages, new stars above his head, and unknown plants beneath his feet. Astronomical observations played a special role in his reflections. He wrote about the visibility of the Southern Cross, a constellation inaccessible to Europeans living north of the equator. He had observed these stars for many nights and used them for navigation, noting their stable position relative to the horizon. The existence of a different sky became for him a symbol that he was in a different geographical zone, one that did not correspond in any way to the maps of Asia. His observations of nature were equally important. In his letters, Vespucci described gigantic trees, fruits unknown in Europe, and the customs of the indigenous peoples, their language, utensils, food, clothing, and rituals. All of this differed sharply from what travellers of previous centuries had reported about the East. His letters, especially those addressed to Lorenzo de' Medici, were not dry reports. They were filled with wonder, a lively interest, and gradually shifted toward increasingly bold hypotheses. Gradually his words began to voice a firm conviction. The discovered land was not the edge of Asia, but something entirely new. In his letters, he first used the expression mundus novus, a new world. Although at that time the term did not yet fully signify a separate continent, it already pointed to a fundamentally new perspective on geographical reality. This new world was not merely an addition to the known world, it was its expansion, its challenge, and its transcendence. One of the episodes that Vespucci particularly remembered was the creation of maps in collaboration with Portuguese astronomers and navigators. On these maps, the coasts of South America stretched so far that it was impossible to fit them into the outlines of the Asian coastlines. Herein lay the essence of his discovery. He did not find gold, nor did he bring back ship holds filled with treasure, but he gave the world coordinates and arguments that began to change the very structure of global thinking. Curiously, Vespucci, unlike Columbus, did not insist on his own priority. He did not declare himself the first discoverer, nor did he build a myth around his name. His strength lay elsewhere, in his ability to observe, analyze, and draw conclusions that went against established opinions. He wrote with restraint but with consistency, and it was this that made his conclusions convincing to those who stood at the forefront of the new geographical science. By 1503, thanks to his letters, the idea of a new world began to spread across Europe. In universities, among cartographers, and within intellectual circles, the hypothesis of a fourth continent started to be discussed. The name Amerigo Vespucci gradually entered common parlance as the name of a man who did not just sail to new shores, but who understood what those shores truly were. This realization was not yet enshrined in scientific treatises. It had not yet become common knowledge. But it was at that moment, in the quiet of a study, over papers inscribed with fine handwriting, that an idea was born, an idea that would soon be printed and disseminated throughout Europe. And within that idea, everything was already present: the geography, the challenge to tradition, and the name that would soon be given to an entire continent. In 1503, Vespucci penned a letter to Lorenzo de' Medici, his longtime friend and patron, sharing his impressions from his latest Portuguese voyage. The letter was not intended for wide circulation, but it was composed with such attention to form and expressiveness that it suggests the author understood his words could take on a life of their own beyond personal correspondence, and that is exactly what happened. The letter found its way to publishers, and the following year it was published in a Latin translation under the title Mundus Novus, or New World. In this letter, Vespucci laid out the key observations made during the expedition. He emphasized that the flotilla had travelled more than 6,000 kilometres along a single coastline, and, in all that time, had not reached its southern extremity. The very birth of Mundus Novus in the text resonated as an intellectual revelation. Vespucci did not merely state that he had visited distant lands. He wrote that he had been to a land which no man before us had known. This was not just a literary turn of phrase. In the context of the early 16th century, such words signified a complete overhaul of geographical understanding. The letter caused a sensation. It was translated, reprinted, and discussed in universities and royal courts. In a single year, it went through at least 5 re-editions in various European cities, from Augsburg to Paris. Around the same time, another text appeared, the Lettera a Soderini, a letter supposedly addressed to Piero Soderini, the head of the Florentine Republic. In it, Vespucci, writing in the first person, describes 4 voyages to the New World, 2 under the Spanish flag and 2 under the Portuguese. He details the routes, describes the customs of the natives, his observations of the sky, plants, and animals, and speaks of encounters with cannibals, the use of manioc, and the rituals and construction of homes in the tropics. However, it was the letter to Soderini that became the source of the first major controversies surrounding Vespucci, primarily because of its claim of a voyage that supposedly predated Columbus's second journey. Historians have yet to reach a consensus on the authenticity of this expedition. Some suggest a confusion of dates, while others believe the letter was not written by Vespucci himself, but by editors seeking to enhance the text's impact. Nevertheless, the style of the letter and many of its details align with Amerigo's other writings, making a complete forgery unlikely, though not impossible. Regardless of the precise accuracy of individual episodes, the letters had an enormous impact on the perception of the discoverers. For the first time, Europeans were presented not with a dry navigator's report, but with a vivid, captivating narrative about previously unknown lands, peoples, skies, and seas. Vespucci's style was characterized by clarity, keen observation, and the ability to convey emotional impressions without sacrificing descriptive accuracy. He wrote not as a man seeking fame, but as one striving to explain what he had seen. His tone was restrained, yet the confidence in his conclusions was palpable in every line. In one letter, he wrote of a dawn that found him on board off the coast of Brazil. The sky brightened, speckled with unfamiliar stars, the humid tropical air was saturated with the scent of foliage, and from the forest came sounds unlike anything he had ever heard in Europe. These descriptions made a profound impression on readers, not just scholars, but merchants, sailors, priests, and students. The letters were copied, read aloud, and discussed in taverns and universities. They were included in geographical collections, treatises, and even artistic works. As these texts spread across Europe, Vespucci's name gained weight. He came to be seen not merely as a participant in expeditions, but as the man who had managed to explain the meaning of what had been seen. He had not just reached new shores, he had given those shores meaning in the European mind. While Columbus continued to insist he had been to the Indies, Vespucci was the first to consistently and publicly declare, "This is not Asia, this is not the East, this is a completely new part of the world." The letters themselves were likely edited for publication, especially the Latin versions, but they preserved the central thread, the revelation of the existence of a new world. It was thanks to these letters, as history would soon show, that the name Amerigo Vespucci would find its place on the map, not in a signature, but as the name of an entire continent. In 1507, in the printing press of the monastery of Saint-Dié in the Duchy of Lorraine, a small book titled Cosmographiae Introductio was published. Its authors were the German humanists Martin Waldseemüller and Matthias Ringmann, who were part of a geographical circle dedicated to understanding the discoveries of the past decade. Along with this publication, a world map created by Waldseemüller was released. It was on this map that the word America first appeared as the name for the new part of the world. In the introduction to the book, the authors wrote that since Europe, Asia, and Africa had all received their names from women, it would be no mistake to name the fourth part of the world America after its discoverer. By that time, Vespucci's writings were already widespread throughout Europe. They had been printed in dozens of editions and translated into Latin, German, French, Italian, and other languages. Thanks to their accessible style, rich descriptions, and confident conclusions, these texts exerted a powerful influence on cartographers and intellectuals. It is important to understand that Waldseemüller and his colleagues did not have access to original navigation logs or official Castilian documents. Their judgments were based on the printed sources available to them, and in these sources the name Amerigo was the most prominent. His texts, even with their inaccuracies and controversial episodes, presented a cohesive narrative in which geographical discovery was accompanied by theoretical reflection. It was this combination of travel and explanation that made Amerigo the central figure for the mapmakers. On Waldseemüller's map, the word America was inscribed along the southeastern part of South America. The depiction of the continent was still incomplete. The northern part was missing, and the Pacific Ocean and the Isthmus of Panama were unknown. However, the idea was planted. If Europe, Asia, and Africa had names, then the new land should have one too. The name America, derived from the Latin form Americus, fit easily into the tradition of classical naming and proved convenient for use. A few years later, likely influenced by new data, Waldseemüller no longer used the word America on a subsequent map, but it was too late. The name had spread and taken root, first among cartographers, then among travellers, scholars, and officials. The name became part of the everyday language of those who spoke of the New World. The doubts that arose later, especially in Spain where Columbus's name held special significance, could no longer change what had happened. The paradox was that Vespucci himself, as far as can be judged, knew nothing about his name appearing on a map. There is no evidence that he ever saw Waldseemüller's map or knew about the publication of the Cosmographiae Introductio. He died in Seville in 1512, long before the term America came into common use throughout Europe. This entire chapter of history unfolded without his knowledge. The name was bestowed not by his will and not at his request. So why not Columbus? The answer is not as simple as it seems. On one hand, Columbus was indeed the first to reach the shores of the New World, but his discoveries were long interpreted as an approach to Asia. On the other hand, his legal and political standing in Castile was complex. After his death, he became the subject of disputes over inheritance, rights, and finances. His letters and reports were less accessible and not as widely distributed. At the same time, Vespucci, without claiming exclusive primacy, presented himself as a rational, well-educated observer, skilled at formulating conclusions and, most importantly, actively published. The name America proved to be a fortunate choice. It sounded familiar, was easily inflected in European languages, and carried a reference to a person rather than a state or a knight, while still retaining a sense of scientific discovery. In the Renaissance era, when maps, measurements, and logic were gaining increasing importance, this form of securing a geographical name felt natural. Thus occurred what would later provoke controversy, irritation, and even accusations of injustice. The name of the new continent was given not to its first discoverer, but to the man who managed to explain what exactly had been discovered. And if Columbus's sails crossed the ocean, it was Vespucci's words, his letters, observations, and generalizations that crossed the boundary between old and new thinking. By 1508, the name of Amerigo Vespucci was already known throughout Europe. He had participated in long sea expeditions under the flags of the two greatest maritime powers, Spain and Portugal, and had published letters that shook the foundations of geographical thought. But after this period of travel, recognition, and publicistic activity, another phase of his life began, one less sensational but equally important, his work in royal service. In that same year, by order of King Ferdinand II of Spain, the position of Piloto Mayor of the Crown was established. This was not an honorary sinecure but a crucial administrative and technical position. The chief navigator was responsible for training and certifying pilots, verifying sea charts and navigational instruments, maintaining hydrographic journals, and overseeing the preparation of maritime expeditions. This position was entrusted precisely to Vespucci, not only because of his authority as a navigator and author, but also thanks to his precise astronomical and practical knowledge. He worked in Seville, in the building of the newly created administration that regulated trade and navigation with the overseas territories. His work days were spent in halls where young pilots mastered cartography and astronomy, where maps were drawn, routes calculated, coordinates corrected, and the behaviour of currents discussed. Vespucci, as contemporary letters attest, was not a harsh instructor, but a meticulous and precise teacher who demanded accuracy and respect for facts. He had no tolerance for approximation, especially in navigational calculations, and always urged his students to double-check their work before trusting it. During these years he no longer went to sea. His life unfolded between measurements, lectures, meetings, and documentation. He watched as the Spanish colonial system expanded, as ships arrived in the port of Seville from the New World, laden with gold, silver, spices, exotic animals, and people. He met with captains who told of new coastlines and helped them interpret what they had seen, sometimes charting their routes himself, sometimes proving they had made mistakes. Over time, Vespucci's health began to decline. He suffered from joint pain, his vision weakened, and his strength faded. In letters to relatives he mentioned fatigue, a lack of desire to continue with routine administrative work, and perhaps a dream of returning to Florence. But he remained at his post until the very end. In February 1512 he died in Seville, likely from the effects of a severe cold. He was about 60 years old. The exact location of his grave is unknown. He may have been buried in the cemetery of a Franciscan monastery, like many officials of the Castilian service at the time. After his death, Vespucci was not forgotten, but neither did he immediately become a hero. His name had already appeared on Waldseemüller's map, but in Spain there was skepticism that the discovery of the continent was attributed not to Columbus, but to a Florentine who had served Castile. Soon, disputes began, at first cautious, then fierce. The main point of contention was the letter to Soderini. Spanish chroniclers accused Vespucci of trying to usurp the laurels of the first discoverer. The debates continued into the 17th century. In some countries he was celebrated, in others his claims were questioned. Some saw him as a wise observer, others as an upstart who was simply in the right place at the right time. In the 19th century, the controversy flared up again with renewed vigour. Against the backdrop of national revisions of the history of the American continent, the question was raised. Why was the continent named after Vespucci, and not Columbus? His letters were analysed line by line, scrutinising for inaccuracies, contradictions and discrepancies between the Latin and Italian versions, with suggestions of interference from editors and publishers. However, despite all the accusations and disputes, Vespucci's contribution to the understanding of the New World remains undeniable. Today, his name is known to every schoolchild. It is not associated with victories in battle, not linked to conquered cities, and not listed among imperial titles. It is part of the world map. In every textbook, on every globe, in every navigation system, it designates the continent that Vespucci himself did not conquer, but managed to explain. His name became a symbol not of conquest, but of comprehension, and in this perhaps lies his true legacy. Amerigo Vespucci became the one who helped Europe see the contours of the world not through the eyes of prejudice, but through the astrolabe, the compass, and the precision of the written record. He did not demand fame, but his words, carefully penned on paper, outlived the ships on which he sailed. He did not seek power, but his name became part of the map that changed humanity's understanding of its own planet.